I love that line, I jotted it down. For those of you who are sports fans or tennis fans will know that line from If you can meet with triumph and disaster and meet those two imposters just the same, where do you see it? Have you seen that line before? Centre court, Wimbledon. Djokovic, yes, I'll say no more. Fantastic. Okay, so from that, we now move to data. We need to know exactly where we are at the moment. We need a sit rep. Let's crunch some numbers. And our next speaker is the guy who's really responsible for bringing us all here today. He's considered a thought leader, creative thinker, academic, entrepreneur, keynote speaker, and author. He's written 2 books and several peer-reviewed articles on a range of subjects, including leadership, sales, emotional intelligence, communication, diversity, and corporate social responsibility. Let's have a little bit of music behind me, because I like the idea of us bouncing and moving on. Today, he applies his experience and expertise as a management consultant, supporting organizations within the public, private, and third sectors. He published the seminal Black Entrepreneur Report last year, and he's also the managing director of Aspire Consultancy, founder of the award-winning Caribbean food brand Marshall and Brown, purveyors of Jamaican fine food. How many of you ate the beautiful food earlier? Yes, the rum cake, was it? That I wolfed down without even biting. It's beautiful. Yes, apart from all of that, he is a senior lecturer at the London School of Business and Finance, a member of the Professional Speaking Association, and a former executive board member of the Association of Business Mentors, and is a fellow of the Association of Professional Sales. Before we welcome him up so we can see him here in 3 dimensions, let's have a look at him in 2 dimensions. Run VT of Dr. Carlton Brown.
I mean, for the last sort of, I suppose, 30 years, I suppose, I've always had an interest in performance and why certain people perform better than others. And what does it take to actually optimize and be the best you can possibly be? Because the moment you start to get into that section, the area of your mind that optimizes what you want to do and how you want to deliver, that's the game changer, as you would call it. That makes the difference between what you thought you were capable of doing to what you can actually start to deliver.
I need to say no more. Dr. Carlton Brown.
Thank you. Thank you. When I was thinking about today, I thought, what am I going to talk about? In terms of representation, in terms of understanding, what is black entrepreneurship? Why is it necessary? Why is it necessary? And I kind of reflected. I thought about my own personal journey, personally, and I thought about it from an academic perspective. So what I'm going to try and do is to recant a little bit about, give you a brief synopsis about black entrepreneurship and a little bit of a taste of my own history. Before I start, though, can anybody tell me who these people are? Top right. Harold Wilson. Sorry. Is that your professor? Is that your Professor Les? Martin Luther King Jr. Harold Wilson. Sidney Poitier. What was significant about that time? Well, Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. Dr. Martin Luther King got awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. Sidney Poitier was the first black actor to receive an Oscar. And it was Beatlemania. But what year was that? Can anybody tell me the year? 1964. 1964. Thank you, Henry. But what was significant about 1964? From my own personal perspective, what was significant was this. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a personal journey. It was 1964. And I'm going to show you this timeline. 1964. The lady on the left is my mother. She came to the UK in 1962. Aspirations to be a nurse. Didn't really happen. But she said, I actually want to start a business. I want to start a small catering business. So she went to the bank and said, could you lend me some money? What did they say? No. But my mother, who's really creative and entrepreneurial, this story is her story, but it's not an unusual story. So she said, well, actually, if I can't If I can't borrow the money, what can I do about it? Now, in West Africa, there's a scheme called Susu. Or in Jamaica, we say partner. It's a social economic system that enables us to borrow money amongst each other. It's not based on trust. So my mother became the banker. So she said, I'm going to be the banker. And so what happens? We invest £20 a week, £10 a week, collectively as a community, and then we borrow the money from each other. So this week, if there's 10 people investing £10, I'm going to get £100 this week, and next week it will be someone else's turn. And that was the economic system. That's how it worked. So that's what she did. Now, she didn't get the business she wanted at the time, but she started it on a part-time basis. But she went to the bank and said, I wanted to borrow some money to start the business. They said no. She just went to the bank and said, I want to borrow some money to buy my house. They said no. So that was a starting point of my understanding in terms of my personal reflection of what was going on. 1988, in my opinion, I met one of the most brilliant entrepreneurs I know. His name was Basil Rennis. He came to the UK as a 12-year-old boy with a suitcase, just full of dreams and aspirations. That's what he did, dreams and aspirations. He became a qualified electrician, but his passion was for property. So when I first met Basil Rennis, who now happens to be my brother-in-law, by the way, he was my role model. He was smart, he was bright, he was energetic. He ended up buying properties in Buckingham Gate, next to Buckingham Palace, St. John's Wood, Hadley Wood, Cuffley, Brookman's Park. I looked at this guy in awe, a 12-year-old guy from Jamaica with just pure ambition, dreams, and aspirations, was able to come and build a property portfolio worth millions. But when the time came to crunch, when business was tough, and he went to the bank, what did they say? No. They said no. So 2 people in my life had this aspiration about borrowing money from the banks. And both times they said no. Then, in 2006, this wonderful young lady, who happens to be my wife, by the way, decided she wanted to go into business. She wanted to open up some wedding shops, but premium wedding shops, high end. And she went to the bank and said, can I borrow some money? What did they say? No. Kind of getting into a bit of a story, this, right? The narrative. People keep saying no. But it didn't stop her from innovating and borrowing the money and getting to the money. But the problem when you borrow money, of course, if you can't get it at the conventional rate, it's at a higher percentage. So you're borrowing money more expensively. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, but what did she do? She borrowed the money and she became one of the most successful bridal businesses in Prenuptia Group, turning over just under £1 million worth of a business, employing 20 people. An amazing story. But initially, the bank said no. I started a business in 2008, a washroom company. I used to work for in my corporate life, I worked for a company called Rentokil Initial. And I ended up being one of the regional directors for Rentokil, and I worked there for 16 years. So when we left, the finance director and myself said, let's start our own business in the washroom market, which we did. And we grew it successfully. But we went to the bank, and guess what they said? No. So I have a history of understanding from my own reflection that sometimes it's difficult to access finance. And I was curious as to why was this the case? Why was this a challenge? Why was it a challenge? So as an academic, I decided to do some investigations because that's what you do. And I wanted to understand. So I looked at lots of different types of research. And lots of research talked about ethnic minorities in general terms, or BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnic, or ethnic minority businesses. But there was not a lot of literature around black entrepreneurship because our story is different. Our lived experience is different. So I really wanted to get underneath that and understand exactly what was going on. So in 2019, I wrote an academic report around corporate social responsibility and purchasing social responsibility. I wanted to understand how are the corporates, the public-private sector, engaging with diversity business in general terms, because a lot of the data surrounded. And what I discovered, there was a disconnect. there was a disconnect between what organizations were purporting to do to what they actually did. Does that make sense? So moving on from that, I looked at the different parts of the literature. And in 2021, I decided that I really wanted to understand what was going on with the black entrepreneur experience. And I'm going to share the data with you shortly. Because, as I said, our lived experience is very different. Our understanding is very different. How we're treated is very different. And the data which is out there predominantly talks about BAME. It's this homogenization that we're all the same, and we're not. So that was one of the earliest reports what talked about just black entrepreneurship, and there's also the Lloyds Bank report which came out also in 2021, which also focused on black entrepreneurship. In the vast majority of the cases, however, it was based on BAME. Now, the term BAME is interesting, but this report was a specific and deliberate departure away from the term BAME. This cultural homogenization, this taxonomy or classification of us as a community needs to be looked at. You cannot aggregate people, they're different. And that's important to understand. And I think it was Stephen Covey that said, if you wish to be understood first, you must understand, okay? So if you need to understand those communities, you can start to then work out strategies of ways of working because you have an understanding. But it's interesting, we talk about politics. There was a report by IPA, and Rishi Sunak, and I have to quote this, Rishi Sunak said, asserts that from a political viewpoint, there's been very limited effort to properly understand Britain's minority communities. And there is a predisposition by the media to homogenize all BMA communities as standard, singular political entities, as if all ethnic minorities had similar views and similar lived experiences. That's not the case. We know that's not the case. So, is entrepreneurship important? The answer is yes. It is yes. It is said that entrepreneurship is the most powerful economic force in the world. The most powerful. Lord Hastings referenced that, about having the ability to do something different, to create something. But are we living on a level playing field? Today I heard the term leveling up. What does leveling up really, really mean? Socially, economically, culturally? But diversity seems to be missed off the agenda, in real terms. But entrepreneurship is there to create wealth, and we know there's disparities in wealth creation. But we need to understand, we'll talk about some of our entrepreneurs, some of the greatest entrepreneurs I know come from this community. And we should never lose sight of that. But yes, you can talk about, we believe that how far you go in life should be based on the talent and how hard you work, and nothing else. I'd love for that statement to be true. I would love for that statement to be true. But sadly, it's not. There are structural and systemic challenges. And Dandridge in 2010 contends that ethnic minority entrepreneurs will often encounter more difficulties than someone else. More. And specifically, black entrepreneurs have even more challenges, even than the general minority population. So it's a challenge, it's a real challenge. So let me give you a brief synopsis of the state of the nation. So what's currently going on? Ethnic minority businesses contribute 25 billion to the UK economy. 25 billion to the UK economy. That's a huge amount. There are circa 300,000 ethnic minority businesses within the UK. But what's really interesting, I take the TikTok story. Why not? About innovation and creativity. There was a study done which says that ethnic minority businesses were found to be more innovative than non-ethnic minority firms. 30% of ethnic minority businesses engaging in recent product or service innovation. So you're more creative. And 11% higher than non-ethnic minority businesses. Now, my mother, when she tried to get money to get a business, she said, well, I can't get the money here, so I'll do it here. I'll have to innovate. Now, there's a guy called Dr. Glenn Lehman who wrote a book called The Jamaican Entrepreneur. And he said there's two reasons why people become entrepreneurs: out of opportunities and out of necessity. Opportunity and necessity. Quite often as a community, we have to do it because of necessity. But also we do it because of opportunities. We see things, we see opportunities, we can innovate in the market. And I'll explain some of that in a moment. But the challenge is 75% of the market perceives us as less than capable, less than competent. That's something we highlighted in our report. So if I'm going to do business in the corporate sector, or the public or the private sector, or the third sector, the perception is, even before you walk in the door, that you're less than capable. Now that's a challenge to overcome. That's a real challenge. But here's the interesting fact for me is this. Ethnic minority businesses today represent 16% of the business population in the UK. But yet still, only 1% of the spend that corporate, public, private sector businesses actually spend with diversity businesses. Now, for me, there's a disconnect. That's a dichotomy. You're saying we want to be truly engaging, we want to have more diversity, but yet still the money you physically spend to those organizations only represents 1% of your spend. Now that has to change in real terms if we want a truly equitable society, because that's what we all wanted to achieve. MSD UK are here in the audience, and they're one of our sponsors. But they wrote a report in 2017 called the Impact Assessment Report. And they did an assessment to their corporate members in their report. And they asked their corporate members, if an ethnic minority business comes to you, what's your perception of those businesses? And 36% of their members at that time said, we believe that that corporate business, those entrepreneurs would be less than capable than our current suppliers. So the perception is at the very beginning, 36% of their members felt we would be less than. So that's also a challenge because perception is greater than reality, right? But it's interesting. When I looked at the study, I looked at the state of the nation. The Federation of Small Businesses wrote a report recently in 2020. They said the vast majority of black entrepreneurs were female. And in our report, in my report, we found 58% of the entrepreneurs were female. Now, what's interesting about it, I've got a good friend, his name's Andrew Piernan. He's from Ghana. And he said, in Ghana, there's an expression, it says, if you ever want to build a nation, you build it through the females. Who would agree with that? Absolutely. Absolutely. You build it through the female lines. Caring, innovative, creative, because they've had to be, for a variety of different complex reasons, which we can't go into here. So let me give you a little bit about the research. What did I find? What did I discover? Well, just to give you some round, broad stroke numbers. Now, a copy of the report, there's a QR code in the corporate conference guide, and you can download a copy of the report. 58% of the entrepreneurs were female. 70% were graduates. At least 37% held bachelor's degrees. 45% were married. 58% identified as Black British. Now, my term is Black African Caribbean Diaspora, is the acronym I've used, because I want to be specific about who we are. The profile were between 45 and 64. 68% represented that category. And interesting enough, 49% have been in business for more than 5 years. Now, what was significant about that? Well, according to Sage, if you start a business within the first 5 years, 50% of your businesses will fail for a variety of different reasons: lack of access to resource, opportunity, finance, marketing, lack of strategy, whatever it might be. But you've got a group of people here who are sustaining their businesses and have got longevity, so there's something there. 86% of them had a turnover between 25 and 100K, 14% had turnovers in excess of £100,000, but 35% were sole traders. But when asked the question of those entrepreneurs, what did they say? What were their responses? 50% of the respondents stated that they lacked access to mentoring and coaching. 51% they lacked access to training and support. 75% of the recipients, the respondents said, they felt that their race was perceived as making them less competent or less capable. 58% stated that their racial identity had a negative impact on gaining access to finance. Well, we know that. I've had a family experience of lack of access to finance and opportunities. And 86% said within the public and private sector, policies, processes, and procedures were unconsciously biased. And 58% said that organizations, there was a perceived lack of acceptance. And acceptance, if you don't feel part of something, you don't want to be part of it. Does that make sense? So I've looked at all of this data, and I looked at the research, and I said, well, what is it? I've looked at the literature, what other people have said. I've looked at the reports. I've looked at asking hundreds of entrepreneurs, black entrepreneurs, about how they feel and what's their lived experience. I've talked to corporate organizations, both corporate, public, and private sector, to try and get an understanding. And I've categorized it, and I've come up with this methodology. I've called it the race paradox. So what does the paradox mean? And I've got to just read my definition of what the race paradox is. Because I still believe there's a disconnect between what organizations want to achieve to what organizations physically do. So I've described the paradox as follows. The paradox is an unconscious illusion of inclusion that conveys the appearance of racial cohesion and an equitable coexistence. But the race paradox is a set of complex, interconnected constructs that gives an organization a cosmetic facade. In other words, sometimes it gives the appearance or sometimes the illusion of doing something when sometimes it's not really happening, and we can support that with the data. This perception is often unsubstantiated, however, the narrative continues to be perpetuated under the gestures and policies and systems. So quite often you say, well, I've got an equal opportunities policy. Great, tick. I've done unconscious bias training, tick. I've got a corporate social responsibility policy, tick. But that's the counterbalance. That's there to prop up the organization and say, well, look, we're doing all of these things. But the numbers don't lie. What doesn't get measured doesn't get done, but the numbers don't lie. And we'll come on to some of that. So there's often an irreconcilable contradiction between the values that an organization perpetuates to what they physically do. So I categorized organizations to 4 categories on this matrix. So one, I've said there are organizations out there who are literally walking the walk. They're doing what they're supposed to do, right? They look at diversity in real sense, in the real terms. And they try, they look at their senior leadership team, you look at procurement, you look at recruitment, they look at promotions, they look at training and access to, they're doing the things they set out to do in real terms. There's still more they can do, don't take me wrong, but there's more they can do. There are those who I called the cultural laggards. These are the companies who come kicking and screaming into the 21st century. They just don't want to change. They're fixed into what they're fixed into. They don't want to shift. Unless the policy or the government says you have to change, they're not going to change. And I've described that set of people, those organizations, of cultural laggards. And there's those I'd like to describe as beacons of change. And I'd like to think people like CBRE who are in the room are beacons of change. When I speak to CBRE and I've seen what they do, they are genuine champions of what they're trying to achieve. They haven't gone all the way yet, there's more to be done. But I would consider them sitting in that category. I'd like to think there's Cotswolds Fair, people like Paul Hargreaves and his team are champions and beacons for real change. But there are those, who are stuck in the paradox. They talk about policies, procedures, and public perceptions. They may even have an advert saying, hey, they'll celebrate Black History Month and have black actors and all sorts of things. But when you go beneath the veneer and test it, really test it, show me how much you spend with diversity businesses. What's the reality? Now, I caveat what I said. If you're running a business, you should be running a good business. with all the right bells and whistles, the structures, the right marketing, the right strategy, the right financial structures. You've got to try and do those things. But some organizations, sadly, are stuck in the paradox. So the questions for the public and private sector, where do you sit? Where are you sitting in this paradox, in this framework? And we need to transition. If you're sitting here as a cultural laggard, what can you do differently tomorrow to make a difference? So we made some recommendations for change. We made 21 recommendations. I'm not going to go through all the 21 recommendations. You can read them after the show. But I'm going to focus on just 3 recommendations here. Firstly, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So one of the action points we make is develop diversity networks. One of the things that is quite often levied is to say, we don't know where the businesses are. Well, they're here. They're here. They're at the London Chamber of Commerce, the Black Business Association. They're at Black Business Recommendations, Black Business Networks, MSD UK. They're there. But it takes effort to go and find it. And quite often we're structured, we're stuck in our ways. We're not willing to change. We have to put the work in. And if you do, you'll find the networks where you can truly engage. I believe that you should have diversity on the boardroom. You should have it on your agenda. Now, I can remember my time within the corporate world. When we used to sit in a quarterly review meeting, we look at the numbers. Sales. Yeah, great. Margins, profit, cash flow, liquidity. All of that stuff we used to look at. But if diversity is not on your agenda, how seriously are you taking it? Is in my view. That's one of my recommendations. You have to change. There has to be diversity of change. And we're going to come on to that very quickly. And what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. You should have a KPI. You should have some sort of key performance indicator that says, this is how we're doing. Because you're saying, I take responsibility for it, and I believe in it. And I'm not just talking about it. I'm not sitting in the race paradox. What are recommendations? Now, anybody from the public sector here? No one from the public sector? Yes, public sector. Brilliant. Public-private sector, it's very difficult to get access to opportunities. And they call them RFQs, RFPs, RFIs, requests for information, requests for quotation. Now, you have to fill in these forms, which can be extensive, just to try and get access to the opportunity in the first place. Just to get access to the opportunity, to be considered even. Now, these forms are extensive. Some organizations have teams of people working on this stuff. Have teams. So if you're an entrepreneur, you can have lots of experience, you can have a great business, and you want access to the opportunities, but sadly, because of some of these pre-qualifications requirements, it becomes prohibitive or difficult. And at some point you go, you know what, it's not worth it. It's just too cumbersome, it's difficult. So I'm going to share a story very quickly about Bola. Bola is part of our conference team. Now, Bola is a highly qualified, experienced quantity surveyor. He's worked on major projects for years. For the last 20, 30 years, he's an experienced, he's highly qualified, as I said. He's worked on projects which are worth multi-millions of pounds. So Bola leaves the industry and says, I'm going to leave working for the corporates and I'm going to set up something for myself. He knocks at the door the next day to those organizations that he was doing business with yesterday working for a corporate. And he steps into the shoes of Bola on his own today. He fills out the pre-qualification questionnaire and says, yesterday I was working here, but today I'm working here. I've got the expertise, I've got the experience, and I'm highly qualified. What do they say? No. The door gets shut on Bola. But Bola's capable, he's experienced, and that's the challenge here. So I talk about deconstruction of the supply chain. You need to think differently to the way you were doing it yesterday as how you do it today. Because if you don't, nothing changes. And it has to change. So that's the first point. Deconstruct the supply chain, make pre-qualification slightly different. Think about a way or strategies for engagement. Secondly, appoint diversity around the board table. When you're making decisions, does representation matter? Does representation matter? Absolutely, yes, it does. You need to have a seat at the table. Why? I'll explain why. There are 6 people sitting around this particular table. So if you think about an organization, they have meetings to decide on recruitment, promotions, training, procurement. There is Mr. Clan. There's Mr. Horn effect, Mr. affinity bias, Mr. conformity bias, Mr. groupthink, and Mr. perception. So what are those people? Well, let's think about the word culture, organizational culture. What does culture mean? Well, Gert Hofstede said that culture is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes one group of people from another. That's what Hofstede said. So you're programmed, 1. 2, Edgar Schein said that culture is about our values and beliefs. So you've got someone who's programmed, now you've got someone who's got values and beliefs. And thirdly, there's others who talk about culture as a clan. What's a clan? So like a tribe. If you belong to a tribe, you're going to support that tribe, correct? So you've got people who are programmed, who are conditioned, and now operating as a clan. Secondly, you've got the Horn effect. Now, on a Saturday afternoon, I have the Horn effect. I support the best team in the world, Arsenal. All the haters in the room? Now, I have nothing better than phoning my brother-in-law up on a Saturday afternoon and saying, how's Spurs getting on? Nothing better. Trust me, there's nothing better. Particularly if we've won, but that's a different story. Anyway. So I already have a negative perception about Spurs on a Saturday afternoon, regardless of anything else. But there are people who have this when they walk into the workplace. They have a negative predisposition and perception about others. So you have to think about who's sitting around the table. Now, Google did some really interesting research about affinity. And they recognized that they were getting a lot of their graduates from MIT. They wore khakis and blue shirts. And they all looked young 25-year-olds who were white or Caucasians. That's what they recognized. And they said, actually, we need to do something different. We are recruiting people who look just like us. And they recognize that. They think the same, they do the same. So you've got Mr. Affinity, you've got Mr. Horn effect, you've got Mr. Clan culture, you have conformity bias. Now, when we conform, I've been in a room, in a corporate boardroom, where my boss has said to the CEO, well, I think in the long term we can do this. And I'm thinking, no, we've got no chance of hell of doing that figure. We haven't. But we've had to kind of go along with him because he's my boss. So politically, you conform sometimes. Even though you disagree with something, people will conform. They'll go along to get along. Ivan Yanis, 1972, said, when you get a group of people together, there's sometimes what we call group thinking. I mean, Boris recently said that when the herd comes to get you. That's a different conversation. But you have a group thinking mindset. So you go along for the collective. Finally, the perception. If you have a perception about a group of people, so if you're sitting around a table and you're thinking about recruitment, you're thinking about procurement, about promotions, and you've got this 6 group of people sitting around the table, how likely is it that you're going to get change? It's highly unlikely you're going to get real change because of those complex constructs sitting in that room. So it needs to change. You need to change the agenda. You need to change people in the room. Because unless you have representation and true cognitive diversity, but diversity in real terms. Now, good example, Lord Hastings, I understand you did some work with Vodafone. Vodafone, 46% of their senior leadership team is female today. They're making that change. I don't know what the rest of the diversity agenda look like, but 46% of their data suggests they're moving along that particular path. And it was Sir John Parker review report said, successful corporate leadership needs benefits from diversity of thought and improved decision making. So before I wrap, I just want to talk about entrepreneurs, just to share something with you about possibilities. There are entrepreneurs in this room. George Fraser said, success runs in our race. If you've not read his book, it's a really interesting read. Byron Dixon, if he was here today, Byron grew up in Leicester, council house. He had two passions: Chelsea Football Club, sadly, and chemistry. He used to play football. He said, I wasn't good enough to make the grade, so I went down the chemistry route. So what he was doing, whilst he played for his Saturday side, he said, look, the trainer smell you get, kind of from trainers. You don't get it, yeah, okay. He said, what I'm going to do, I've created this concoction, which is antimicrobial, and I'm going to impregnate it into those football boots to try and reduce the lack of smell. He created something today which is now a multi-million-pound business because of his passion for football and his passion for chemistry. He took something and innovated an idea. Danny Manu, how wonderful would it be to go to Ghana and speak Tree? How wonderful would it be to go to the Middle East and speak Arabic or Kalamash Arabi? How wonderful would it be to go to Spain and speak Spanish? Danny Manu came up with an earpod called Click that instantaneously translates 40 languages. If I'm speaking to you in Tree, Arabic, Spanish, or Italian, it will translate instantaneously. He's from Manchester, young Ghanaian boy who grew up in Manchester. Innovation, creativity. You want a property portfolio? Talk about Basil Rennis, Dyken Dryden, Eric Collins, Jamal Edwards. Think of rest in peace. But that young brother, amazing young man, launched the careers like Ed Sheeran, Dave, from the camera. Just come up with an idea, innovation, creativity. But if you want to go back in history, next time you have a packet of crisps, think about George Crumb, because he created the crisps that you and I eat today. But there's lots more examples that we have. Talent runs in our race. Never lose sight of that. Innovation and creativity runs in our race. In your goodie bag, you have a packet of crisps from the Black Farmer, Wilfred Emmanuel Jones. He will tell you his own story. You have Claire, Dr. Claire, who sits here, was one of the, when he talked about veganism and plant-based beauty products, she was ahead of her game, ahead of her time. And she sits right in this room, she innovated. But there are lots more examples, but I can't always go through. So, in my close. When I was at Rentokil, we used to sit in the boardroom once a quarter, and Sir Clive Thompson said, we used to say, well, if our numbers were not adding up, and we were not delivering the numbers, he used to say to us, well, we will say, we'll get it right in the long term. We'll get it right. And he would say simply this: the long term is simply a series of short terms. Let's get the short term right. If we're running a business, thinking about our long term, let's think about the short term. Let's get our short term right. But for the corporates, the public-private sector, where are you today? Let's think about the long term, but let's try and think about the short term, and let's get the short term right. Stephen Covey said, for the 7 habits of highly effective people, I'm just going to talk about the first 2. Be proactive. Do something different today to make a real difference. And he always says, starts with the second principle, start with the end in mind. What do you want to achieve? Whether you're a corporate, when you think about your goals, your aspirations, where do you want to be? What do you want to achieve? And can we do something different? So when you look back on your journey, you say, this time next year, what have I done? What does my numbers look like? Have I really changed? And I think René Descartes said it best for me, the French philosopher. He said, to know what people really think, pay attention to what they do rather than what they say. The acid test is when you look at the numbers and you can see true diversity, true engagement. That's what will make a true difference. More needs to be done, we know that. But let's take a step today in the right direction. There's opportunity, there's creative people, there are great entrepreneurs, but collaboratively, strategically, if we do the right things and work collaboratively together, we can make a real difference. Thank you.